The census taken in 2010 lets us know that there are 309.3 million people living in America. Now, for a second, I'd like you to imagine what would happen if the 35 least populated states, which accounts for approximately 29% of the total population, were to have died within the 5 years that the census had been taken. Such a horrifying and devastating event took place in Europe in 1346 in an event that is known as the Black Death. Black Death was obviously a horrible time for Europeans. However, it's still incredibly important to our history, and I think everyone should know why. So in my speech, I will be giving a brief build-up to the Great Famine, which is a precursor to the Black Death. I will also be discussing the arrival of the disease and the spread of it through Europe, and finally I will be discussing how Europe was able to bounce back from such a devastating blow. In 1315, we have what is known as the Great Famine. And the Great Famine is exactly what it sounds like. It was widespread starvation due to inefficient crop growth. It's not exactly the farmers' fault that the crops didn't produce as much as they needed to. The European population was booming, and it was the biggest that it had ever been. So when inclement weather kept the farmers from growing as much food as needed to feed everyone, a lot of people starved. And in fact, Lynn Nelson, author of the article entitled The Great Famine and the Black Death, wrote, "By the spring of 1317, all classes of society were suffering, although, as might be expected, the lower class suffered the most." And in fact, the lower class is a really interesting study because they are by far and away the most numerous people of the time. And it is these children that are going to be growing up in 30 years experiencing the Black Death themselves. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that these children were not fed enough food to receive the nutrients that they could have needed to be a healthy, functioning adult. These weaknesses are going to be made abundantly clear when the Black Death hits in 30 years. Now, as the sickness spreads, it's primarily spreading from south to north and east to west, due mainly to geography. As we see, the Mediterranean Sea and the Crimean Sea are right there at the south, and they're right there as soon as the disease gets into Europe. Now, the reasons for this is due largely in part to the boats. A lot of you might already know this, but the rats who live on these boats have a big hand in spreading the disease. In fact, it is the fleas that the rats carry that are able to make the transition from rat to human simply because the hygiene is not exactly top-notch. So when these fleas infect a human with this disease, which we commonly associate with the bubonic plague, it creates these buboes, these large lumps that you see. And these buboes are essentially infected lymph nodes, which then infect the immune system, which spells disaster any way you slice it. In his article appearing in History Today, Ole Benedictau wrote, "The infection takes 3 to 5 days to incubate in people before they fall ill, and another 3 to 5 days before, in 80% of the cases, the victim die." So it's a really devastating disease in every sense of the word. And from 1346 to 1351, the disease spreads across Europe and eventually stops when it hits northern Russia. And about a fourth to a third of the Europeans have died as a result. Now, the effects of this are obviously terrible. So many people have died and so many families have been split up by death. However, less people means less problems. There's not as many people to feed, and it just makes for an easier society, as horrible and as morbid as that sounds. But really, it's the ideals, it's the culture that emerges after the Black Death. It's the way that people have stopped fearing death as much. They start looking at life in a new way. They start doing things a lot differently. In fact, according to a PLOS ONE article written by Sharon DeWitt, overall risks of mortality were lower post-Black Death population than before the epidemic. So this means people are living longer, they're taking better care of themselves, and they're also having a way different style of thinking than what they've been used to. In fact, in the decades and centuries after the Black Death, we see the emergence of the Renaissance. Now, for those of you who know about the Renaissance, it is an incredibly culturally advanced time for the whole world, essentially. New ways of thinking produce new inventions, new art, as you can see. It's just a really prosperous time. So it makes you wonder, since this is a result of the Black Death, would the Renaissance have happened had it not been for the Black Death? It's a very interesting question to explore, and one that we can't really answer. But I'd certainly make the case for, had the Black Death not happened, it may have been a while for the Renaissance to happen. And with so many advancements in the Renaissance, it's hard to know where we'd be today without the Black Death. So, as cataclysmic and as terrible as this disease was, it is a very important part of our past. And I think everyone should know it, and because it really shaped history. Through the Great Famine, through the diseased fleas, and the widespread death, emerge a new way of thinking, new ideas, new growth that really contribute to an advanced European society. The Black Death did not set Europe back. It enabled the battered continent to look at the future with a new sense of hope, the effects of which we can still see today.